Hello there, thrill seekers! And my hair is certainly thrilling today, so I hope you'll enjoy that. I have been accused of Buddhist modernism. And actually, rereading this tweet, I'm not sure if the guy is accusing me of Buddhist modernism or accusing somebody else of it. But let's read the tweet anyway, because I think it's worth commenting on whether it's me being accused of Buddhist modernism or this other person. Anyway, no thanks. We won't worry about what the thread is about because it's not that interesting. I almost likely know more about Buddhism than you. You look like one of those Western weirdos who has swallowed Buddhist modernism line, hook, and sinker. Should be hook, line, and sinker, I think. And now your life boils down to role-playing a custom-made Buddhism that no one before the 19th century knew. Okay. So, Buddhist modernism is one of these terms that we're hearing a lot these days, or I'm hearing a lot these days, being, one of these people who talks about Buddhism on the internet. It's a dumb job to have. But where does it come from? Well, I'm not sure that David McMahon, no relation to Ed, I suppose, came up with the term Buddhist modernism, but he certainly wrote a book called The Making of Buddhist Modernism, which came out in, I want to get this right, I don't want to do this from memory, 2008 from Oxford University Press. And I bought it pretty soon after it was published. I might have bought it in 2009 or 2010. I remember reading it when I was living in Akron, which was, I moved back to Akron briefly, and that was the year 2010 plus a bit of either 2011 or 2009, I can't remember. I was there for like a year and some change. And I remember reading this book when I lived there, so that helps me figure out when I read this. And I'm only saying this long-winded thing because I want to apologize that I haven't read this book for a long time. It's been at least 13 years since I last looked at this book, but I still have it, so I must like it. So because of this tweet and because I wanted to make a video about it, I went back and reread at least part of the chapter about meditation, which I found to be the most interesting because that's what I do. I teach meditation, write about meditation, and I thought that was the most interesting chapter. So that's what's freshest in my mind. So this idea of Buddhist modernism, though, gets thrown around a lot lately, and people are often accused of it, and I guess I'm being accused of it, or at least by association being accused of it. So the idea of Buddhist modernism, and speaking from memory of reading this book 13 years ago, is that the current form of Buddhism that we are practicing and hearing and seeing a lot of things written about, etc., in the West these days is as much of a product of a kind of Western interpretation of Buddhism through the lens of Romanticism and pragmatism and Descartes and a lot of Western philosophy, as it is the ancient Buddhism of old. So it's a Buddhism that has been specifically tailored to appeal to Western audiences. Let me see if I can find this definition that I came across the other day. It may not be a perfect quote, but it'll give you some idea. Okay, I'm kind of jumping in the middle of this thing about reflexivity and neurobiology, and we're not going to worry about that, but that's why the quote will seem a little bit disjointed. But this will give you an idea where this book is headed. It worked its way into Western interpretations of Buddhism first in the 19th and early 20th century conceptions of Buddhism as a rational religion compatible with science. Buddhism gained entry into modern Western culture in part by being represented as a path of human development that accorded with Western conceptions of the perfectibility of man through rational action, moral reflection, disengaged self-observation, and the attainment of control over the passions. And so on and so forth. So the idea is that Buddhism, in order to flourish in the West, the people who sort of started presenting it to Westerners, people like D.T. Suzuki is one person who's cited very often in this book, and other people, but Suzuki gets a lot of the blame for this. They wanted to present a Buddhism as a rational religion that was compatible with science and let me see what I wrote in my little notes, devoid of superstitious and religious elements. So they wanted to get rid of all the superstition and religion and present a palatable version of Buddhism to the West, and this is Buddhist modernism. So it's not the real Buddhism, is the idea. Now, reading this book again, or reading the nearly the end chapter where he talks about meditation again, I realized that the take that David L. McMahon gives us is much more nuanced than what this guy on Twitter seems to be putting forward. And he does seem to understand Buddhism, at least in an academic way. A lot of these academics don't want to practice Buddhism, and they figure it will they won't be able to be objective about it if they actually practice. Now, I don't remember if McMahon says he practices or not, but certainly the pieces that I read near the end sound like they're written by an academic who hasn't practiced. And as I always say, you can get a lot out of that kind of study of Buddhism. You can understand the philosophical point of view of Buddhism just by studying it academically. That's probably possible. I think it's possible. But it's a bit like trying to talk about baseball after just studying baseball academically but never having played baseball, or to talk about music after studying music theory, that's Ziggy anyway, after studying music theory academically but not being able to play an instrument or sing yourself, having no experience of that actual practice. And I think that's really, really important, especially when it comes to Buddhism. But the point he makes is fairly nuanced. But what happens to these ideas when they kind of enter the public sphere is they get reduced into something. My favorite example, which I won't be able to come up with off the top of my head, is there's a lot of people who will quote this one line that appears on the back of the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. And it doesn't seem like they've read the book at all. There was a couple of years ago, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think she's a House of Representatives person, I think in Brooklyn maybe, I don't know. Kind of famous in America these days for kind of getting on the internet and saying things that either upset people or excite people. Anyway, she quoted that book, but again, like everybody else, she only quotes this little blurb on the back of the book. And I get the impression like a lot of people have read the blurb on the back of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, but haven't read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, all of the book, let alone ever practice Zazen. So you get a lot of that. So I think that's what happens with this book. A lot of people, I think these days, are familiar with the fact that there's a book called Buddhist Modernism, and they're familiar with the basic idea that Buddhism has been presented to the West in a palatable way that sees it through the lens of Western philosophy and a lot of very specifically Western things, like I mentioned Descartes and so forth, but isn't the real Buddhism. So this gives people the impression, and again, I'm not saying that David McMahon is saying this in his book, because he's not. But I get the idea that a lot of people who haven't really read the book or don't really understand the book are of the mind that there is a real pristine Buddhism back there. Maybe it exists in Asia in some untouched city that hasn't been influenced by the Western world at all, like such a place could exist. That kind of Shangri-La myth. Or that it existed in the distant past as that was the real Buddhism, and now what we're getting isn't the real Buddhism. It's a fake Buddhism. It's Buddhist modernism, which is fake. And this idea, I think, is born of our Western understandings of Western religions, because the way I understand it, the idea of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the Abrahamic religions, is that the pristine form of the religion is the version that existed, let's say, when Jesus was alive. I don't want to pick on the other two religions because one of them gets very upset when you pick on them. So let's not talk about them. But let's talk about Christian. So the real Christianity is the Christianity that existed when Christ was around, when Jesus Christ himself was around, because Jesus Christ himself is the only person who can ever tell us what real Christianity is, because he's the Son of God. He's a special person, and only he knows, and his disciples heard it, and they wrote it down, and so forth, and I don't know what you want to believe about what they wrote down, but the pristine form is way back there in the past, and now we're trying to uncover that and trying to get the unadulterated, pristine form of the religion as it existed in its original kernel in the distant past. Buddhism isn't like that. At least, and you might accuse me of Buddhist modernism for saying that, but I really think we can see it in the actual things that are left over from the past, that it has never been a religion which was trying to fix itself like it was fixed at the time of Buddha. So everything Buddha spoke was Buddhism, and anything that comes along later is not Buddhism. That would be the sort of Christian attitude towards Buddhism, but I don't think that's the way the Buddha intended it. If I want to, I'm kind of hoisting myself on. No, what's the word? I'm kind of cutting down my own argument by saying this way, but I do think this is true. That the originators of Buddhism didn't intend to make a static religion which could never be changed, where this was the word as it was, and then any other changes, you can't make them, and you're wrong because it existed in the past. So I think the fact that Buddhism has changed over the years and has absorbed things from a lot of different places. So it didn't just start absorbing things in the 19th century from the West and was pristine up until that moment. It was absorbing influences all along, from Taoism, we can see, from Hinduism, we can see, everybody knows this who's studied it, and from other religions and other philosophies, and trying to kind of use what's best from them. So my own teacher, Gudo Nishijima Roshi, would probably be accused by this guy on Twitter also of Buddhist modernism, because he was very fond of the West, particularly America. He had a great sort of fondness for the American approach to things, which he said was pragmatic. And he thought that the philosophy of pragmatism had a lot to offer to Buddhism, because Buddhism is essentially pragmatic. It's essentially a philosophy, a practice that you do, and you do what works in that pragmatic way. We're not worried about the philosophy and all this other stuff. So the other point I wanted to make is one of the things that Buddhist modernism is accused of doing is getting rid of the sort of superstitious or religious aspects. So, for example, and this is one thing Nishijima Roshi was often did, recasting. For example, there are a lot of references, maybe not a lot, but there are references here and there in Shobogenzo where Dogen talks about things like demons or other realms. And one of my favorite examples, because I'm a vegetarian, is the one where a monk is eating meat in the temple and the other monks are kind of like, why are you letting this guy eat meat? We're supposed to be strict vegetarians. And Dogen explains it, saying that there is a demon living on top of the monk's head who is actually stealing the meat and eating it before the monk actually gets to eat it. And he's allowing this because it's feeding this demon. I can't remember. I don't even remember exactly where that appears in Shobogenzo, if it appears in maybe Zui Monkey or one of the other books. But anyway, Dogen talks about things like that. So you'll come across Dogen talking about demons and heavens and hells and things. And Nishijima Roshi would always say, when people would question him about that, he would say, well, you can just think of these as psychological states. You don't have to believe that he's talking about actual demons sitting on somebody's actual head that are little red dudes with a suit and a tail and all the other stuff and horns. You don't think of that. Think of it as a psychological state. Think of heavens and hells as descriptions of psychological states. Now, this book, Buddhist Modernism, does take that idea to task, saying that's a modern interpretation. But see, this is where I get weird. I start thinking, well, maybe these, and this, I think this is the way Nishijima Roshi thought too, maybe these are just different cultural ways of describing the same phenomenon, and neither one is really right. It's not, maybe thinking of it as actual heavens and hells as places, up in the sky and down in the ground is wrong. But maybe also thinking of the situations people get into. I know somebody right now who's going through a situation which probably in his personal subjective experience is hell. He's a person kind of related to me, going through this, and I think, well, that's hell. You don't need a place called hell if you are suffering in this world we all live in as deep and profound way as this person is. So you can think of it as a psychological state, or you can think of it as a place underground, but neither of those is right. So that's the idea, and I think that's what we're working with. So the kind of people who use Buddhist modernist as a pejorative, the way this guy on Twitter was doing, are kind of saying, well, the real Buddhism is the Buddhism that believes in actual demons and actual heavens and hells. And if you think they're psychological states, you're just a sucker for Buddhist modernism, or a dupe of Buddhist modernism, or whatever he says in the tweet. And I don't think that's quite true. I don't think that's how it works. But I think the book itself, having just started to reread the chapter on meditation, as I said, I think it's a good book. And I think it's worth reading if you're into reading this kind of stuff. Let's hold it on this side too, so I can get a nice screenshot for the thumbnail. Anyway, it's a good book if you're looking for a nice academic take on this idea of Buddhist modernism and how it's been influenced on the West. I think it's worth reading, but I also think we should be maybe a little careful with our accusations of "you're a Buddhist modernist" without understanding the subtleties of what he says, because he does seem to understand that a lot of these things he's accusing Buddhism of importing from Western philosophy, a lot of them kind of did exist in the original pristine Buddhism of the past too. So it's not that far-fetched to apply some of these Western concepts to Buddhism. It's not 100% wrong. He's just saying this is something to notice, and it's an interesting, and certainly from an academic point of view, real interesting. So there you go. That's my short take on Buddhist modernism. I hope it wasn't just too garbled to understand. If you want to contribute to me making more garbled videos like this, you can go to the URL that you're seeing on the screen below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. There you will find links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts. Those are my main and usually only ways of making a living, and I appreciate your support. But as always, you don't got to support me if you don't want to support me. And I want you to notice that at the end of these videos for the last month or so, I've been putting a little card that says stuff about my European tour. That's starting in just 2 or 3 weeks, I think, in the beginning of August. So all of those events that you're going to see at the end of the screen, they're all open to the public, and I think maybe Benedictus Hof might be full up, but you could certainly ask them because they're often willing to take people later. But the other ones I know are definitely not full up. I mean, they're open. They'll take as many people as want to sign up for them. So please sign up and show up and say hello to me when I'm in Europe in August. Okay, see you later. Have a good time all the time.